Welcome to the Academic Framework Module 7. Our topic for today is Assessment for ELLs and for ALL. What, why, and how do we assess all of our learners? But where does this fit in our Academic Framework for Literacy? Let's take a look at our shelter graphic to find out. The foundational piece is always getting to know your students, their home language, and prior schooling and experiences. Then we build on that with background knowledge and vocabulary. And oral language is also a building block piece of our shelter framework. Then don't forget our pillars, register, grammar, and genre. Finally, we have our roof, assessment, which of course runs throughout. In this session, we will look at what is assessment, why do we even assess our students, and how do we assess not just our English language learners, but all learners. Let's start with a working definition. Assessment is a wide variety of methods or tools that educators use to evaluate, measure, and document the academic readiness, learning progress, skill acquisition, or educational needs of the student. And here our key word is needs, meeting our students' needs. When thinking about the question, what is assessment? We can think of it in many different ways. A planning assessment is when we look at some of the academic skills of our students, oral, written, and reading, and then we use that assessment to plan for instruction. This is super important, in particular for our English language learners, who actually get a yearly assessment that is done in the spring or in September. Without knowing where our students are at, we cannot plan for where to go. We can also think of assessment in terms of formative and summative. Formative is assessment for learning. It enhances or guides learning. It's ongoing and it's often informal in nature. Summative assessment is assessment of learning. It is to show what you know. It's usually cumulative and sometimes more formal. Here are some key words that we associate with formative assessment. Notice that they all sort of circulate around reflecting and modifying, informing our practice. An example of a piece of formative assessment might be the 3-2-1 form, where students can give us quick feedback on what they got out of the lesson, and perhaps what they still need. Summative assessment feels less like the dress rehearsal and more like the final performance. And so we can see that the words associated with summative assessment revolve around systematic measurement and sort of finality, though we are always growing and learning. An example of summative assessment could be a mind map like this one of plants shown in the slide. But let's rewind a little bit and think about, why do we even assess students? Assessment helps us to make informed decisions about next steps, about curricular goals, etc. Assessment also helps us to uncover the strengths of our students and the needs of our students. Assessment provides feedback for the learner so that they can self-assess and perhaps think about next steps. Assessment is also a communication tool where we communicate with the student, with the parent, and with others. Now that we've looked a little bit at the what and the why, let's look at the how. How do we assess our learners? It is important to have variety, clear communication, criteria, and adaptations. One way in which we can ensure a variety of assessment tasks is through triangulation of evidence. This is the notion that we can assess students not just through products, but through observations and conversations. Here are some examples of specific assignments you might give to students in order to look at the 3 aspects of triangulation. Take a moment, pause the video, and read some of the examples. Another factor in how we assess is clear communication. We need to share our learning standards with the students. And for English language learners in particular, that means sharing the language goals, the content goals, and the competency goals in language that they can understand. Here's an example of some reading goals with added language goals at the bottom. We can also co-create criteria and rubrics with our students. In this way, they know exactly what it is we're looking for or exactly what it is that the learning standard means. And finally, for all our learners, but especially our English language learners, it is important to show exemplars if you have them. That way a student can see visually what is expected of them in the assignment. When thinking about access points and assessment for students who might be struggling learners, we can adapt using graphic organizers. Perhaps if the class is writing long answers, an English language learner might use a graphic organizer instead. Graphic organizers allow our learners to show what they know in an alternate form and allows them to show their thinking process. We can also adapt the quantity. Certainly many of our struggling learners get daunted with many questions on the page. So we can give them fewer questions and extra time to help with that. How have we worded our questions on assessments? We can scaffold these with sentence frames and chunking. Let's look at the example below. A question that one might see on a science test: name and define the 3 major types of interactions among organisms. An adaptation that we can use with a sentence frame and chunking looks like this. The 3 types of interactions among organisms. The first type of interaction is called blank. This means blank. And so we've scaffolded this for the learner so that they can show us what they know without getting bogged down in the language. We can further scaffold and chunk for our English language learners or any student who needs it with word banks and visuals. Pause the video for a moment and take a look at the example below that uses both word banks and visuals. Here is the same assessment with even further scaffolds. Take a moment to give it a read. And finally, don't correct everything. It would be very frustrating to have all our work corrected, particularly in red pen as shown above. Focus on the 1 or 2 things that you decided as a class or as a teacher were important. Let's take a moment to reflect. Think back to a unit that you completed with your students. And knowing now what you know about assessment, what might you have done differently? Consider a variety of assessment types: triangulation of evidence, criteria and rubrics, scaffolds, and adaptations. Thank you for taking the time to learn with us today. If you'd like to learn more, check out our YouTube channel, English Language Learners Hooray! And click on subscribe so that you know when we've added new videos. Have fun playing with assessment.